It's 5 o'clock Friday, and you know what that means, gang. It's that time to crank up the old Hank Williams Jr. song, Take This Job and Shove It. No, that was Johnny Paycheck. I'm sorry, I get my country music mixed up there every once in a while, but you know what I'm referring to. It's 5 o'clock Friday, and that means it's time for the Happy Hour Live webcast from WhiskyCast.com. I'm Mark Gillespie in the WhiskyCast studio. Hope you have had a good week. It has been a really fun week around here. Had one of the kids at home, our youngest daughter, Tessa, who's in medical school out in California, has been home for a few days during the end of the semester break. And it has been good having her home. And had a lot of good whiskeys. I will tell you that we're sort of breaking news right now because all of my colleagues are still on a webcast that started about 42 minutes ago with the folks at Uncle Nearest down in Tennessee. Tomorrow is Juneteenth, as you may have heard, the newest federal holiday in the U.S. And Uncle Nearest, of course, is named for Nathan Nearest Green, the enslaved man who helped Jack Daniel learn how to distill. And then after the Civil War ended and the slaves were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, wound up working alongside Jack Daniel at his distillery in Lynchburg, Tennessee, and was actually the first head distiller for Jack Daniels. The Nearest Green folks have revived that memory and that history just up the road in Shelbyville, Tennessee. Tomorrow they're opening phase 2 of their distillery and visitors center as part of Juneteenth celebrations. And if you're not familiar with Juneteenth, it celebrates the day in Texas, of all places, where the last word came that the North had won the Civil War and that slaves had been freed. Union soldiers arrived in Galveston and started spreading the word throughout Texas that slaves had been freed. So they're opening the Uncle Nearest Visitor Center tomorrow on Juneteenth, and they have 2 new distillery editions that I've been sampling, the Uncle Nearest Master Blend from Victoria Edie Butler and Uncle Nearest 1820, an 11-year-old single barrel product that had been out on the market originally as a single barrel. In retail, it has now been pulled back and will be only available at the distillery. So that's what I've been sipping on for a little while here. But let's get to our main topic now. We're going to talk about American whiskey of another type. If you caught the webcast the other day, American single malt whiskey has been booming in popularity. We now have somewhere around 170 distilleries in the United States making single malts of one type or another, peated, unpeated, finished, all sorts of stuff. But there is no definition for American single malt whiskey in the U.S. federal regulations. In fact, there is no definition for single malt whiskey, period. But the TTB, our favorite 3-letter agency in the whiskey world, has decided to do something about that. They have started the regulatory process to create a, quote, standard of identity. Non-bureaucratic language, we call that a definition for American single malt whiskey. And I am joined right now by a bunch of folks who are experts on this because they make the stuff and have had some influence or are trying to have some influence in how the government defines American single malt whiskey. I want to start off with Steve Hawley from Westland in Seattle, who is the president, the head poobah at the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission. We're also joined by Jeff Kanof on the upper right, who is just down the road from Westland at Copperworks Distillery in Seattle. And across the bottom, from left to right, we have Stephen Gould from the Golden Moon Distillery in Golden, Colorado. Our longtime friend Jared Himstedt from Balcones in Waco, Texas. And Ty Phelps from Andalusia Distilling Company in Blanco, Texas, somewhere between Austin and San Antonio, about an hour or so south of Austin, and a lot farther south than Waco. I would assume that's the case, right, Ty?
Same state, but very different place, yeah.
So, guys, first of all, let's get some reactions to the TTB finally getting off the dime and starting this process. I know that you guys have wanted this for a number of years now. What has it meant, first of all, to not have an actual definition for single malt whiskey in the United States, especially for American single malt. What has it meant to you guys to not have this, and what does it mean now? And Steve, you want to start off since you're leading the commission?
Yeah, sure. First of all, Mark, thanks for having us. Really appreciate you giving us the time and the platform. As you mentioned, it was big news this week that the TTB has added us to their what they call the unified agenda. Man, TTB is just the start. There's going to be all kinds of acronyms and legislative language and all kinds of buzzwords that we'll probably have to explain along the way. But we're excited, measured excitement here by the announcement that came out this week, something that we've been talking to them about for quite a long time. And, to your first question, I'd love to hear the other guys speak to it. But there's really implications to not having a definition, across the board, whether that's speaking to consumers, speaking to the trade, and just kind of functionally us as distillers, what we can and cannot do, or what we should or should not be doing, what we need to be doing. All of those things are topics that we need to tackle, in the absence of a definition. And all of those things become imminently easier when there is a definition. So I'll let the guys speak to it on, the street level realities of dealing with consumers and dealing with the trade and dealing with, their own team in the production world.
Who wants to take this one first? I know when I look at a retail shelf, I see American single malts all over the place. I see them with bourbons. I see them with ryes. I've seen them mixed in with Canadian whiskeys, for crying out loud. And then they put them in with single malt scotches. Stephen, why don't you start off with Golden Moon?
Well, so we're in Golden, Colorado. We do a line of single malts that are made from two-row Moravian barley, which is malted right here in Golden. Probably the biggest challenge we have is getting people to actually understand what the product is. And I think that if TTB comes up with a category, it's another step in the right direction for us to get the American whiskey drinking public to really understand this is what an American single malt is. I mean, right now, bourbon, rye, it's very clear. Your whiskey aficionados, your hobbyists, regular drinkers, all pretty much can figure out by going online, and people know what those are. I mean, you still see consumers trying to figure that out, but they do know what they are. If TTB comes in with a definition, it's going to be a huge step for us in establishing or continuing to establish American single malts as a unique and distinct category.
What happens now when you guys try to submit a label for approval for an American single malt to the TTB? Is it getting through? Do they give you grief about it? I know they've given folks from the so-called non-traditional whiskey countries grief over it in the past for their single malts. Do you guys get any grief from the TTB now?
We get multiple different answers depending on which label specialist is looking at it. There is no consistency. There is no consistent answer. And when you kick it up a level, you'll get another answer. When you kick it up another level, they might finally give you the first answer or give you the answer you were hoping for. But because there's no definition, there's nothing but confusion.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, I'll add that I agree. There's no consistency. We typically can get ours through, though, which is great for us, but it also is a risk for the category in general, right? Because that means if there's no consistency and you can usually get it through, there's a fear that someone's going to get something through that really isn't anywhere close to what the world consumers know of as single malt whiskey. So that can be really damaging to the category in the long run. So having a final definition on the category is going to help eliminate some of that, give clarity to us into what we should be putting on our label, and therefore get more consistency at the TTB level.
Ty, how about you?
Yeah, I would agree. I think this is just a huge first step towards, something that's very positive from a consumer perspective. I don't expect consumers to have a copy of the TTB standards of identity in their back pocket at all times, but I think just kind of getting the ball rolling in that direction is huge. We haven't had any problems, with label approval. We've only had a few that we tried. And usually we'll kind of put words on different lines, single on a different line as malt whiskey or something like that, just to kind of help ease the process.
We should explain what you guys fall under now as the current definition for malt whiskey in many ways, which is not single malt by any stretch, right?
Correct. Yeah. So it's a very narrow definition of malt whiskeys, and so that's going to be similar to bourbon and rye definitions of 51% malt, brand new oak barrel. So these are some things that might apply to some malt whiskeys, but most certainly not all of them.
And let's go through what the current requirement is for malt whiskey. As you mentioned, 51% malted barley, brand new oak barrels, and then the other requirements. And Jared, you want to jump in on that one? What do you have to distill your malt to now?
What do we got to do? Under 160, can't bottle under 40, the usual just kind of overarching whiskey stuff. I think it's such a funny thing. I wish we could figure out who actually has used the American malt whiskey definition historically. Not very many. Kind of begs the question of why it existed in the first place. But obviously with the virgin oak, nobody wants to label a product, whiskey distilled from a malt mash if you're using used oak. That's not fun. I don't know anybody walking in a liquor store asking for where that section is. But I think almost all of our stuff, if you go and look at approvals, I think most of it ends up just being categorized as just whiskey, not even malt whiskey. Yeah. Which with the changes last season, that's okay now. If you want to just use whiskey as the overarching category, you're allowed to do that. So that's the safest place currently in my mind to put American single malts, because none of those other restrictions, you don't get stuck with virgin oak, you don't get stuck with the 51, you don't.
Let's go through what you guys would like to have. And we've got a graphic here that sort of explains what the proposal is that you've submitted in the past to the TTB, especially when they did the rewrite of the federal regulations for alcohol labeling about a year and a half ago, but then chose to punt this one and kick the can down the road for another year or two until we got to this debate. Steve, explain what this is. This is taken directly from your website and what you've submitted to the TTB.
Yeah, this is, again, what our proposed standard of identity would be for American single malt whiskey. And, on one hand, it is quite straightforward, and that's intentional. We wanted to align generally and fundamentally with what consumers think of as single malt whiskey all over the world. One thing that's really important to point out is that we are very much motivated to have a formal standard of identity here in the States for the business that we do in the States. But we also are looking to protect the category overseas as well. A number of us are selling whiskey in markets all over the world, and it's important that consumers all over the world pick up an American single malt whiskey and have some confidence that they know it's in that bottle. So that standard of identity was crafted in 2016 now, March of 2016. A small handful of us, 9 of us, met in a blizzard in Chicago at the Binny's on Merced. And we had actually scheduled, I think, 3 hours to sit down and hash it out and kind of have some battles over things. And quite honestly, it took us about 30 minutes to draft it. There weren't any huge debates. There weren't any kind of significant questions that needed to be answered, because in the end, it was all relatively straightforward, right? American single malt whiskey should be made in America. Pretty straightforward. Those first 3, it should be made from malted barley. And we have a couple questions that come in often about other malted grains and whatnot, rye being the kind of, lead question that we get. And we have no problem with labeling something American single malt rye whiskey. But when it comes to single malt whiskey and what that means globally, that means made from 100% malted barley. So the rest of those were, somewhat designed designed largely to fit within the vernacular that our government, that the TTB currently uses to describe things. The last thing that we wanted to do was to come in and fundamentally alter how whiskey is described or how a subcategory within whiskey is described and make them create a whole new set of rules or language options that don't really apply to anything else that is already in the beverage alcohol manual, the BAM. Here we go with the acronyms again, right? So it was important to kind of align with the way they talked about things in other categories within whiskey specifically, or spirits more broadly. And then finally, the last goal was really to leave out a couple things that you find specifically in the Scotch whiskey language, because they don't really apply to us here in the States. And one of the things that everybody involved was really intent on was to leave room for creativity and innovation. And we think that's a strength. We think that the vast geography that we have here in the States is something to recognize and acknowledge when it comes to how we all want to and need to make whiskey in our various regions. So we wanted to leave space to allow for that innovation to happen, to not restrict the category out of the gate in a way, frankly, that we see the Scotch whiskey industry do to itself, and for reasons that we understand. But you know, in America, we don't need to burden ourselves with some of those restrictions. So we wanted to have some meaning. Oh, such as a minimum age requirement. You know, for us here in Seattle, we're working with a completely different climate than Stephen and Ty and Jared, you know, from Colorado to Texas. I mean, to suggest that the aging realities, the climate realities, can be consistent across the board is just kind of misguided. We didn't want to have the pot still regulation that they have in the Scotch whiskey definition, because, you know, we have all grown out of a tradition here in the States that is using hybrid stills and other types of equipment. But we wrote into those last three clauses, you know, certain ways to maintain the integrity of the flavor that's coming from the malt, which is really what that pot still clause is in the Scotch whiskey definition anyway. So again, it was a balancing of innovation and using the language that the TTB uses to basically arrive at the same end that they're trying to do with some of those other things. And
let's explain the difference between the pot still rule that the Scotch whiskey folks have and the maximum distillation to 80 proof or 160 proof, 80% ABV that the U.S. regulations have. Basically, those are designed to sort of offset each other. I know I was talking with your colleague, Matt Hoffman, about it earlier this week, and he explained that to me, that that's to keep that flavor in there, right?
Right. And, you know, Jared, you're a good one to speak to this. You're a distiller, and I'm not. So.
The goal with the 80 is to keep the flavor, and we already have other categories for, you know, spirit whiskey and light whiskey and things that go higher. But the other side of it, and Matt talks about this often, there was a level of pragmatism. So, you know, the entry proof, the max distillation proof, the lowest bottling proof, those are things that, like, to go to the TTB and ask them to move a bookend that defines whiskey broadly and affects every category within there, that's just a non-starter. But when you think about pot still and column, the SWA has very well defined what those are. So they could ding you for something because they have a legal definition for it. There's nothing in the TTB regs that articulates equipment that specifically. So to introduce something like that, and they would have to figure out how are we going to define that? There's a whole other, you know, can of worms that you would open if you went down that path. And I was one of the few that was like, yeah, pot still, because
you have pot stills.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course. I wanted everyone else to have to shut down. No, I mean, we part of what we wanted to do is not get stuck, and this comes up a lot too. Partly, Copperworks had to deal with some of this, but obviously some of the analogs between Japanese whiskey and the lack of regulation, and then so what happened with the barrel aged gin. The chances that we were going to get slapped with a definition were pretty good. That's going to come, and we figured we might as well drive that. It may not be perfect. There's always things. We've got active members and even board members that aren't 1,000,000% down with what we ended up with, but they understand how we got here, and it's the broadest we could go to protect the creativity and innovation of American distillers, and at the same time get something done, which was, ultimately the main goal. So.
We've had a comment from Donner Pass Whiskey. So new oak barrels are in the rules. Well, they're in the current rules for malt whiskey. And what you've proposed, and I want to pull this graphic up again, just so everybody understands it, what you're saying is sort of like the Scottish rule, matured in oak casks, which could either be new or used, right?
Correct. Yeah, I want to be clear. We are not proposing anything like the malt whiskey definition or standard of identity that's currently in there. And very few of the almost 200 distilleries in this country that are making single malt are using that definition. Again, most of us are using whiskey. If you look at most of our bottles, you'll see American single malt on one line and whiskey on another. So in essence, the TTB is, I can't do this with the screen. The TTB is just not looking at the American single malt part, because that doesn't exist. They're looking at the whiskey part. Our bottles collectively here, I believe, on this call, all use that same kind of formula. It says whiskey. That's what we are to the TTB. So malt whiskey is a separate thing. And again, to Jared's point, not many have ever used it, let alone are currently using it.
Stephen, I want to get you in on this because both you and Ty are running relatively small distilleries compared to what Balcones and Westland run, and even what Copperworks runs. And I want to bring you guys in on the smoller side. Stephen, tell me what your concerns on this with the still definitions.
Well, so you have to look back at the history. And by the way, Copperworks and Golden Moon are almost exactly the same size. And we know each other well. If you look historically in Scotland, and for that matter in Ireland, your stills have always been pot still. And so most of the whiskey that you see made in Scotland that is a single malt is a double distilled product. And that 2 passes through a still, typically a larger still and a smaller still, a wash still and a spirit still. We here in America, because we've had this craft kind of free-for-all that has led to where we are in the American distilling world today, we came up with a host of different types of stills that some leaned on tradition, others went their own way. And so what you see people, as Steve mentioned, with hybrids that are combining that double pass into a single pass and getting a very solid result. My old consultant partner, David Pickrell, for example, was known for building hybrid stills that would allow you to do 1 pass from wash to spirit. And that was the way he liked to build distillery. Now, having said that, here at Golden Moon, I have a wash still and a spirit still, fairly Scottish in layout. I happen to prefer that, but it sure as heck isn't the only way. But if we were to specify, like the Scots have, a pot still, we would simply rule out a lot of what is American craft whiskey tradition that makes American whiskeys and American single malts unique. And that's something we didn't want to do.
Ty, let me get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would agree. And if I could just expound on that a little, it's sort of traditional for American craft beverages, whether or not it's craft beer or craft spirits, to sort of rely and take kind of classic styles that are from around the world, often from Europe, bring them back home and sort of put our own spin on them, sort of make them our own. And I think that this allows us to continue to have that level of creativity without being tied to sort of the guidelines from where some of these traditions are coming from. For example, we do a very traditional peated single malt. We also do more of a Texas smoked single malt. And so that second product, wouldn't qualify at all, as a single malt whiskey in Scotland. And so there's all kinds of different qualifications that may or may not fit with kind of what you're wanting to do from a creativity perspective. So, I think we've only got one product, I think, even though they're all malt whiskeys, I think only one of them is categorized as a malt whiskey because it uses the new barrel. We use a lot of Yuzo for our other stuff. But all the other ones, I think, like Steve had shown, will have, single malt or something on a separate line. So, like I said, we only have one that's technically actually a malt whiskey according to TTB.
I want to answer a quick question here. We've had a couple of folks ask about the regulations. There's nothing on coloring or chill filtration on purpose, and that's from both Pete Head and Lord Crump, and that's because the U.S. regulations don't even cover caramel coloring or chill filtration right now. So it doesn't theoretically make sense to bring that in from what, Steve, from what your comment was about not giving the TTB any more to do than you really want them to do. You want them just to do the basics here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't want to ask them to create something new for us from a kind of a regulatory standpoint or a language standpoint, like I was talking about. Also, we have to keep in mind, I mean, the TTB is a very small organization. They're part of the Treasury Department, which has a much broader agenda. They average around 180 to 190,000 label approvals per year, and that's across, spirits, beer, wine. I mean, they have an enormous task. And they also don't have a history, a very long history with the beverage alcohol manual, which I mentioned before, which is, what Ty, I think Ty, you were saying, or maybe Jared, people don't carry that around, customers don't carry around the BAM in their pocket. I mean,
if you go to the right whiskey show, that there might be someone.
Yeah, I mean, some of the whiskey shows.
Real nerds.
Yeah.
We have a link to it on the website if you really want to nerd out.
But, they hadn't changed that in over 3 decades until their, proposed rules a couple of years ago. And, it's a monumental task to do something like that. We're asking to be included in that process. They've got, 180,000 labels they have to review along the way. They've got changing administrations and priorities at the Treasury Department level. The last time that they've actually updated this in a significant way, like they have in the last several years, was 3 decades ago, and they weren't even part of the Treasury Department at that point. So there's not a lot of institutional knowledge about how this is even supposed to happen. So, we have to. We get
and to be fair, Steve, a lot of the language in there wasn't even changed from 1935,
exactly,
when the Federal Alcohol Act was passed after the end of Prohibition.
Yeah.
So they were dealing with a lot of this stuff that was literally 80 years old.
You're absolutely right. And we get a lot of people that come to us that are kind of, waving their fists saying, get angry with the TTB. And we pause them, we say, you guys have to give them a little slack, right? This is a very complicated thing to do. And they have a lot on their plate, and they're truly doing the best they can to put forward more information, more clarity for the consumer, which is what this is all about in the end, right? We're all doing this because we want the consumer to understand what they're buying off that shelf. And if that takes a little time, look, we're all whiskey distillers. We're used to being patient, right?
Well, to be fair, their main job is to collect taxes from you guys.
Fair enough.
And they do that very well.
They've got that dialed in, don't they?
Yeah. I want to give, because folks are pretty familiar with Balcones and also with Westland, because Jared and Steve and Matt Hoffman, Westland's head distiller, have both been on the show a number of times. But Stephen, Ty, Jeff, this is your first appearance on the webcast, so I want to give you guys a chance to talk about your origin stories, how you got into malt whiskey distillation in the first place, and what you're doing that's unique with your distilleries. And Ty, I want to start with you.
Yeah, sure. My life with malt whiskey started with a 15-year career in craft beer. And so shortly right out of college, I worked for Dell Computer and had an office space experience, and got quickly into the beer world. And as you know, I think all of us, as we get a little bit older, we're going to be drinking a little less beer and a little more whiskey. And I think that I found myself doing that. And so got into malt whiskey about 5 years ago. We started Andalusia Whiskey Company. We're near Blanco, Texas, kind of in between Austin and San Antonio. The distillery is on our working family farm. We have sheep and cattle and chickens and llama. And so it's about a 120-acre farm. And the distillery's been a big win for our farm out there. All of our spent grain and our effluent is sent to the farm. And we're able to allow the customers to have a really fun farm experience when they come out. We're doing only single malt whiskeys. This is kind of where my tastes lie. Not only, coming from the beer world, we sort of had a lot of that process dialed in, but these are the kind of whiskeys I like to drink. And so we're just dealing with malted barley. And so our equipment really limits us to that. We've got equipment for making beer, essentially. And so we also kind of do what a lot of the craft malt distillers are doing is we kind of take a beer brewer's approach to making whiskey. We'll use a lot of specialty malts, chocolate malts, crystal malts, Munich Vienna malts. And obviously the color from those malts don't come through, but some really beautiful, wonderful flavors come through. So we've got a couple products that are traditional and then a couple that are more innovative. We have 3 malt whiskeys that are distributed in the state of Texas. We've got our triple distilled, which is very much like a Irish whiskey. We have a Revned Oak, which is a peated single malt. We import peat from Ireland and do all of our own smoking and peating of malt ourselves. And those are somewhat traditional. And then a little more innovative is a product called Striker. We take that malt and instead of smoking with peat, we'll smoke the grain as if it was Texas barbecue. So oak, mesquite, applewood, and then also we'll age that one in a new barrel. And so pretty much taking a classic product like Scotch and bringing it home to Texas and kind of making it our own. We've got a beautiful tasting room in the Hill Country. We really look for tourists. We're right in the middle of wine country in Texas as well, in the Texas Hill Country. So we've got a lot of tourism, a lot of folks out for the day looking for tours and cocktails and drinks and stuff. And so we're in a great area for that. And like I said, we're about 5 years old. We're going to do our 5th anniversary coming up here in a couple months. And we're a little off grid. So we're 100% rainwater also for every step of our process because we don't have access to any other water where we are. So that makes us a little different as well.
And when the droughts hit like they have in the Hill Country, you guys are pretty well screwed, aren't you?
A couple months ago, let me tell you. But we've gotten 10 inches of rain in the month of May, so it's been a great month for us. So haven't run out of water yet, so we'll see.
And what you're doing with the smoked wood in doing some of your grain sounds a lot like what Jared has done at Balcones in the past.
Yeah,
with brimstone and a few other things.
Yeah, brimstone was a big inspiration for us. This whiskey is, I know a little bit about that whiskey, not a whole lot, but I definitely know this is made very different than what they're doing. But definitely very similar flavor profiles in the end. It's definitely not the smoked beast that brimstone is, but it's probably more on the light to moderate smoke level.
Stephen, how do you guys stand out at Golden Moon from all the other Colorado distilleries? Because there are some folks doing some really cool stuff in Colorado. How do you stand out?
Yeah, so we have 116, I believe, is the last number for distilleries here in Colorado. And a lot of whiskey is made here. We make a variety of different products here at Golden Moon. Our single malts are all distilled from two-row Moravian barley. That is a strain of barley that was brought over in 1947 by, of all people, the Coors family. It's been propagated here in Colorado, Idaho, and Wyoming. There's a big malt house right down the street. And so everything we do as far as single malt is from that malt house, at least for ourselves. We've done some stuff for other people with other malts. Our water is Rocky Mountain water. So here in Golden, we're blessed to get water that is from the Montezuma and Clear Creek watersheds of the Rocky Mountains. And that's good, but it's also a challenge because it's very hard. It's got a lot of calcium. It has seasonal iron. It's got a lot of minerals that are great for fermentation. But it means that our deep proofing water needs to be filtered pretty heavily or we get flecking in the bottles. but it ends up giving a very nice, very distinct taste to the whiskey. And then we use a variety of different types, sizes, and woods in our casks. So our products will go through anywhere from 1 to 3 casks before they're put into a bottle, and with different chars, different woods, some new, some used, a combination thereof, really to build complexity. And they're all part of the maturation piece, is really a part of the distiller's toolkit that I think is often overlooked by many people. I mean, people will say, and they'll go, I want to use only a 53-gallon American oak barrel, and it's got to be in there for 2 to 3 years. And if you look pre-industrial revolution, that's not what people did. And if you go to some of the older family-owned distilleries in Scotland, if you go to brandy makers in Spain, there's lots of fun things, cool things that they're doing that we've learned from and have integrated into our processes. So everything is going to be one type of barley, and then all the other flavor inputs are things we do. Now, the other thing we do, we use a totally proprietary atypical yeast. So where a typical M-class yeast, which is what most whiskey makers around the world use, would take about 72 hours for a fermentation here in Colorado, our yeast, unfortunately, takes 4 to 5 days, but we get a hell of a lot more conjugal development, and it's a unique conjugal development. I like it. My staff likes it. Our drinkers like it. And considering we keep winning awards, I think the judges like it. And then we also have a proprietary method of mashing. Now, a lot of American single malt producers mash like brewers, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I mean, every one of these guys I'm looking at on this screen, they make great whiskeys. I don't know how you all mash except for Copperworks, and I know you mash like a brewer. We mash sort of, we do a multi-water mash. It's a derivative of a Scottish mash, but I juggle my strike temperatures. I build in some inefficiency, which adds some additional conjugal development. We get a slightly lower yield. We get a much higher malty character out of whiskey. So we've worked very hard because Colorado is really malt country. It's beer country. We worked very hard to make sure that our whiskeys have a very distinct malty character that sets them apart from others.
How does the altitude in Colorado affect your fermentation? I'm curious because I know it affects distillation and the temperatures, but how does it affect fermentation?
Altitude doesn't really seem to be a problem with fermentation. It doesn't really seem to affect it at all, near as I can tell. It sure as heck affects maturation. It does affect distillation a little bit. The biggest challenge for us is angel share. And, our distillery is at over 6,000 feet here in Golden. And we're certainly not the highest distillery in Colorado by a long shot. But, depending on the weather, we can lose as much as 7 and 9% in year one to the angels. And that's huge. I was having a discussion the other day with a friend of mine that runs Woody Creek, which is in Carbondale outside of Aspen. And they're almost at the exact same altitude we are on the other side of the ridge, other side of the Rockies. And, we were having this discussion about managing angel share and different ways of doing it. We tend to get, because of altitude, we get a much quicker level of extraction. And that has to do with the atmospheric pressure and lack of humidity and et cetera. And if we're not careful, when stuff gets a little older, it can turn over oak very, very, very quickly. For our second line of whiskeys, Gunfighter American whiskeys, which are found spirits, when we bring in 10, 11, 12-year-old whiskeys from someplace like Kentucky or Tennessee, if we put them in the rick house and just let them sit, they may be beautiful when they walk in the door, but if we're not careful, 6, 12, 24 months later, they can be over oaky and only good for blending at that point. So altitude definitely has an effect, but really not on fermentation.
So Jeff, tell us about Copperworks. You guys are close to downtown, even closer, I think, to downtown than Westland is. You guys are right on the water, right?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends how you define downtown, but we're technically in the downtown area, right on the waterfront. So if you just look basically right across the street from the Great Wheel, the big Ferris wheel in Seattle, we're right there on the waterfront. So it's a really fun
Westland
location.
is down the street from the stadiums, so they're in Sodo. So
Yeah, they're a little bit outside of downtown, but it's really, I don't know, what, 1.5, 2 miles away. You could walk it if you really felt like it. Certainly a quick Uber, things like that. Steve's not walking it.
I'll take an Uber.
There's no such thing as a quick Uber in Seattle. I've found that out.
I was going to say, being from Texas, I've been to both, and I wouldn't know which one's more downtown than the other. I don't know the difference. It all feels
So
pretty
tell us
down.
about Copperworks.
Yeah, so as Stephen Gould alluded to, we're brewers, so we do everything like a brewer would in terms of the brewing and fermentation. So my two partners have over 60 years of brewing experience between the two of them. So we actually start by selecting really high quality malted barley and then brewing at partner breweries. So we work with Elysian Brewing here in town and Fremont Brewing, and we make our mash at their facilities, bring it in-house to ours. We ferment with a real brewer's yeast. We typically are using Elysian's ale yeast, so we get that fresh from them. So we're not using a dry yeast in any way. Then we do a relatively long fermentation for a whiskey, usually 5 or 6 days. And then we double pot distill just like the Scots would. So at that point, we start to look a little more traditional Scottish single malt. We have Forsyth stills, so it's visually very traditional looking once you get up to the still house deck. But then when it comes to the maturation, we've done all kinds of things across the board. So we certainly do a lot of new oak, both because we love the flavor of it, but also it's very American in nature because of a lot of the reasons we've talked about already on this video here. So we've played around with sherry barrels. We obviously refill our own barrels after we empty them. And one of the things that's really unique about our whiskey is every bottle has a release number. So we're not trying to create, a core lineup of 2 or 3 whiskeys. We actually make every release unique on purpose. So when we look to make our next release, we have been tasting all along, and we're thinking about which casks we want to use. And then once we come up with sort of an idea or a concept, we start tweaking it with other casks. We also change the proof because everyone is sort of unique. So we've hovered around 100 most of the time, but we do go up and down depending on the flavors that are coming out. But it's a really fun way to do it because as we're talking about this brand new category of whiskey, we can really explore, right? We don't have to be locked into a concept that we picked when we opened. We can explore the different possibilities of this category. And frankly, eventually we probably will have, 1 or 2 bottlings that are a little more consistent. But for the time being, we really like to play and bring some different types of barley into things. You've probably heard when Westland's been on the show about, how much barley activity is going on in Washington in terms of growing interesting varietals, craft maltsters popping up and things like that.
And Steve, I know Matt and the boys were playing with some purple barley earlier this week, right?
Yeah, purples, reds, blacks. This week was a variety that was grown in eastern Washington called Purple Egyptian. So yeah, if you follow us on Instagram or whatnot, we'll be showing a little behind the scenes of what that was like making some of that this week here at the distillery. It's pretty wild.
And I say this only just to have a little fun with you, Steve. Jeff kind of beat you guys to the Washington peated whiskey thing with the peat from that bog out in the Olympic Peninsula.
That's right. Yeah, you guys were, that was about 6 months ago, right, Jeff? And we're still probably a year away from releasing ours.
Yeah, we released it right in the midst of the holidays, early December. And we owe a lot to Westland for creating that opportunity. There's no way that would have even existed without Westland. So, even though ours came out first, it really wouldn't be possible with them. And I think that's something that a lot of people should know is, we're down the street, we're making the same style of whiskey, but we're great friends and we love working together and pushing this category forward. I think same for everyone on this and most on the entire commission. So a lot of times consumers wonder, is there big competitiveness? And my answer would be absolutely not.
Yeah,
although you might have to start your car when we're done tonight after Steve gets over there from somebody started for you.
That's why I live in Tacoma, so he can't get to my car too easily.
He's a little far afield for me. But I did see a question in the comments here, and I don't remember the words specifically, but it was about how big can this category get, and
I was just heading there, Steve.
Oh, great! There you go. Look at that.
We're
on the same page. But I think to Jeff's point is we are 100% still in the rising tide lifts all boats. I know that on the commission we've got 170 plus distilleries, and I know that may sound like a lot out of 2,500 distilleries in this country, give or take 100 here or there. It is a lot from a number standpoint, but from, obviously whiskey is booming. Everybody that's tuning in today is thirsting for all different types of whiskeys. I mean, even just looking at the comments talking about, I'm drinking this, but I'm moving to this next and that after that. So, I mean, there's a lot of room for all of us here. And this category is absolutely still in its infancy. And I think there is, we all believe on this call that American single malt is the next big thing in whiskey. I think the Japanese were the first to prove, 30 years or so ago that, great single malt can be made outside of Scotland, and other regions are doing that. And I think customers out there are buying all of it, and they're playing around, they're promiscuous. Brand promiscuous is what we always say. So.
But let's ask the second half of this question that Chris Ratcliffe posed. And what is the challenge to getting consumers to try an American single malt when they know pretty much what a single malt Scotch is, or a bourbon, or an Irish whiskey? What's the challenge to getting them to try your American single malts? And I want to start with, let's start with Jared, because we haven't heard much from Jared lately, and you've done these for a while. So I want to start with Jared.
I think that's very generous to think that the American drinkers know what bourbon means or rye means, or that most single malt is Scotch, which is actually kind of the sweet spot. I mean, obviously, with a lot of our smaller distilleries, we interact with a pretty educated, we over-index with actually pretty educated consumers. But the bulk of the whiskey drinker in America doesn't really know that much about. They know a few things that might get, like how bourbon has to get made in Kentucky, things like that. Those kinds of facts.
Yeah, but Jared, I've seen you in London trying to sell British consumers on American whiskey and American single malt. So you've tried to deal with people who know what single malt is.
I think there's been two really helpful things specifically that have helped what we're doing. I think world malt in general. I think Taiwan, Japan, India, New Zealand, Australia. These are places, the attention that all these other single malt producing regions have gotten in the last 10 years has made this conversation a lot easier to handle. And then on top of that, you add India and Taiwan specifically, that hot climate conversation has also gotten infinitely easier over the last 5 to 6 years. People are way more familiar with some of those profiles that a hot climate can give you. But that's part of what we wanted to do with the commission wasn't just get a standard of identity made. We are all out there, trumpeting the cause individually, and doing that collectively. We can all spin up and do the same work over and over and over, or we can do it collectively, have a much broader voice, and hopefully do it a lot less times, and get some inertia going where I don't have to have a conversation with Ryan at Julio's to say, hey, can we have a single malt area? And everybody has that conversation, and eventually he does it. We can talk to him as a group, we can talk to national chains as a group, distributors, restaurants, all that. And hopefully, Steve always tells me all the time, walking into a store and they say, oh, I don't really carry American single malt. And then you go and you find 15 or 17 in their store or on the menu. But that's a little bit how PR and marketing go. Like, we just have to keep beating the drum, and we've been doing it for a while now, and we're finally starting to see some results from it, but it's pretty far from over, I think.
And I was walking through a Total Wine shop near here. We have one about a mile or so from the house, and I was walking through the other day, and I'm looking and I'm going, okay, where's the American single malts? And I'm seeing, let's see, there's Balcones single malts in with the Balcones bourbons in the bourbon section. Westland's over with all the Canadian whiskeys for some reason. And they've got American single malts all over the damn place. And I'm going, y'all really could use a consultant to help you straighten this stuff out. I'm available, but I'm just going, at what point do we get these guys to get their heads together, and does it take a definition to be able to actually tell the retailers, put the American single malts together, and here's why?
Well, I think in our experience, the definition is actually important that front. There's two real reasons. Two real reasons we need the definition. One is to protect the category from unscrupulous folks out there putting American single malt on something that's not actually single malt. The other is what you're talking about, Mark. It's trade and press. You know, you and your colleagues as well. We've talked to competitions. We've talked to publications who do product reviews, and they all say, well, we'll make a category when it's official with the TTB. We hear some stores saying that as well. Some of those national accounts, but even some of the independent whiskey stores that you know get it on so many levels say, well, until there's really a formal category, I'm not going to make that shelf. And that's a problem. You know, if someone's coming into the store looking for single malt, they're not going to the bourbon section. They're not going to the craft section. They're not going to the other section. They're going to the single malt section, which unfortunately too often is just called Scotch. And I know from speaking with them that our brethren in Australia and Taiwan and Japan aren't too happy about that either. But at least they are starting to have, you know, some definitions, and now we're close on the heels of that as well. And
the problem is that you can argue back to them saying, you know, the TTB doesn't actually have a standard for single malt whiskey from Scotland. They let the Scots define it. They let the Irish define what Irish whiskey is. They let the Canadians define what Canadian whiskey is. And there's no TTB definition there, which is why we don't have a definition for single malt at all in the regulations right now.
Well, and quite honestly, and we say this all the time, you know, if the trade recognizes the category and the consumers recognize the category, again, aside from protecting ourselves against those unscrupulous players, you know, we're happy, right? If the category exists in the minds of the people that matter, that's all we're really after. The formal legal definition is the signature on the paper. So, you know, that's our argument with those guys, which is, you know, it's the chicken and the egg argument, right? You know, if you make a shelf for us, if you put us on the menu, if you talk to your consumers and your customers about American single malt and qualify it that way, then the category exists.
Yeah. So I want to bring up this comment from our pal Natasha McGill down in New Zealand, who's been writing about U.S. single malt growth for at least 3 years, and she thinks the volume we have in market and offshore is really exciting. The innovation and flavor exploration is what makes it so full of possibility. Here in New Zealand and Australia, there's much more of a global and less Scotch-centric perspective emerging. Do you need that definition to help you in the export markets and explain it to them?
It helps. I know me and Steve have talked about it. Some specific countries that are asking for verification that this is indeed American single malt, which of course is funny because that just means that Steve needs to rubber stamp all of our stuff, right? But that came up recently. I was like, what can I, you know, somebody wants some sort of official letter from the commission saying this thing that says American single malt actually is, which also, you know, makes it kind of funny and a little sad that like we're still trying to get this pushed through here, and yet I've got European countries that aren't going to take it without a letter from Steve Hawley, you know, which he could, I guess, withhold if you wanted to be.
Steve's the most powerful guy in American whiskey right now.
Did you misplace that? Is it somewhere? It's somewhere around on your desk. I'm sure you'll get around to it.
Somewhere around here.
Hey, Steve, if I haven't said so, thank you for that letter. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, Stephen had the same issue, and you know, I'm happy to write those letters. The commission is happy to write those letters, and I'm glad that the commission exists so that we can do stuff like that and have real commercial impact for our members across the world. But it is, to Jared's point.
Wait a second. People, you mean to tell me that people overseas are actually buying this commission, this industry group that you guys have created, as a
authority,
real powerful agency with the ability to issue a certificate saying, yeah, this stuff's American single malt whiskey? Please tell me this isn't the case.
Yeah,
it is.
I mean,
it is.
Apparently, yeah, some foreign governments are taking this seriously a little bit sooner.
Sweet Jesus.
Yeah. It was funny. He's like, yeah, is there certificates? Like, yeah, there's not really such a thing. Not yet.
It's interesting because I'm also finding a lot of consumers in other countries are taking it more seriously faster than some folks on our home turf as well. You know, there's a lot of excitement when we start thinking about export that we don't always see when we think about, you know, entering another state or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And there's the question that you just put up here, Mark, is that, you know, there's a history of the SWA kind of legislating throughout the world, and that's not really the way we see ourselves. You know, the commission isn't here to police its membership and to enforce rules on people. The commission is here to promote and advocate for the category, and I think that there's certain things that we can do to kind of give that seal of approval, as it were, you know, both literally and figuratively. But I think to Dave's point here, I think the whiskey drinking world is kind of conditioned to this to some extent, and that's a sad commentary, honestly. That's why you're, you know, hanging your head in gloom over there, Mark.
Well, I'm thinking, wait a second, these bureaucrats should know better. But I'm going, wait a second. Okay, yes, trade associations have obviously a very important place, like the SWA. And I'm just thinking, wait a second, they're taking your word, and because I'm going, okay, because the U.S. basically, for those who are not aware in the audience, the U.S. essentially has a carve-out in the federal regulations for 3 countries, Scotland, Ireland, and Canada. And whatever those 3 countries define in their country as whiskey, we automatically accept, period. Everybody else goes through the 3rd degree when it comes to scrutiny. They've got to submit formulas. They've got to have it lab analyzed. They get crapped on when it comes to being called single malt, things like that. We've had distilleries in England and Wales that have both had problems getting their whiskeys called single malts, even though they're part of the United Kingdom, because they're not Scotland. So Scotland gets this exemption that England and Wales and Northern Ireland don't get. And it's just this whole bureaucratic thing, and I'm going, this is why people drink for a living, guys. As Lord Crump points out, yes, bureaucrats should know better. That's the funniest thing ever said on WhiskyCast. Yeah, thanks, guys. In reality, and Dave Kuhn makes a great point here. We're talking about transparency here. And I think that's what you guys really want at the end, is to be able to be transparent and say, this is what we're doing. This is a standard that we're doing it to. And we have a clear standard, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, as long as everybody knows what something means, it's actually useful. You know, those words actually become communication. And if they can mean anything, then what's the point, you know? Which is part of, you know, the defending some of the global and historic aspects of the definition while still allowing for American innovation, which is a part of the American craft tradition. You know, trying to find that synthesis was really important.
You know, right now we're seeing across the food and beverage world, consumers want to know what they're eating, what they're drinking, and where it comes from. And transparency is not only good for ensuring that the consumer is getting what they think they're getting, but it's good, to be blunt, as marketing, because then when they see it, and there are consumers, especially on the higher end of the booze categories, that will go out, they will look research, they will find who's doing what they want. And if the American single malt category is properly defined, that just makes it so much easier for us to market to those consumers that want to spend for American single malt. And they'll know without having to do the digging what they're getting.
I have an interesting question that sort of came up earlier this week in the light of the whole issue over tariffs, because I was asked in an interview to talk about the whole concept of the need to market internationally versus consuming local. And Stephen, as you just pointed out, I'm wondering whether it almost makes more sense for the smaller American single malt distillers and the smaller craft distillers just to focus on that area within 50 to 100 miles of your distillery and dominate that market and not try to worry about the export markets where somebody can cut off your access or raise or impose tariffs on you and you have no control over it. But within that 100 miles radius of your distillery, you can control what your market is and you know what you're getting and you know where your sales are coming from. But if you try to export and you try to grow beyond your local market, you wind up getting in a position of vulnerability that you can't control. Is that fair to say?
All business is a risk, and some distilleries can focus on their local market and get enough sales to achieve their business goal, run, and the owners can make a living. Some distilleries aren't going to have that business model. And every distiller, every distillery owner, every brand owner needs to make that decision for themselves. And, the larger you get, the more you try and go into new markets, the more risk is there, but the more for potential reward is there as well.
Really good point. I want to give you guys a chance to sort of tell us what you're working on right now. And Jared, I want to start with you. What are you working on? What are we going to see from Balcones in the next few months that you can talk about without the marketing guys strangling you?
Man, I don't even know anymore. The bigger we get,
you strangle Jared through that beard.
Yeah, you can't get. You see how thick this neck is? You can't get your hands around this neck. No, I have unfortunately gotten used to whatever we. My hand slapped a few times in the last few years as we get more of a chain of command. This year,
Jared, you're breaking up there. You want to try again?
Yeah. Am I okay?
You're okay now. Try it again.
Okay. Even though we make a bunch of different whiskey styles, as you know, we have been focusing pretty hard on malt this year on purpose, with the fingers crossed, hoping that this was the year that the standard of identity would maybe go through. We do a ton of stuff that's Texas only. It's not getting out of state, but we've had a lot of fun working with Texas winemakers and some unique finish opportunities there. As Ty knows, the Texas beverage grade, malting grade barley situation is really just like 4 or 5 years old. So every season, every harvest season, there's new varieties from new farms coming to the table that we're laying down. So that the spreadsheet with the all the barley, which farm it came from, which maltster, floor malted, drum malted, all that. The spreadsheet's kind of complicated and messy, but we haven't gotten that far down that road. That's one of the next really fun things that we're looking forward to seeing good results from in the next 3 to 5 years. So,
Jeff, what are you working on?
So I'll go a little whiskey adjacent in that we're working on a big expansion right now. So we are actually going to be launching a crowdfunding campaign to raise some money to build a new facility. It'll actually be up to 4 separate buildings on a campus that's in Kenmore, Washington. So just a bit north of where we are in Seattle. So it's kind of breaking news. We haven't really said this anywhere except kind of privately, but it should be launching in the next month or so. We're super excited. It should allow us to make about 10 times as much American single malt whiskey as we make right now. And it will give us some additional visitor areas with tours, tastings, full restaurant, things like that. So be on the lookout for that from us in the next 4 to 6 weeks, probably.
Stephen, what are you working on?
Well, we just launched a couple of new malt products. So we just launched a triple distilled Irish style single malt. As some of you know, I work part-time in Ireland as a master distiller as well. We just launched a 100% malted barley shochu, which is not really a single malt whiskey, but it's sort of single malt adjacent because it's a single malt shochu. And then we're going to be launching a series of specialty cast finish whiskeys. And then because we have the second line Gunfighter, which is found whiskeys, we're actually going to do a master's blend. It's a blend of our single malt distillate and older Kentucky and Tennessee whiskeys. And those will be limited releases we'll bring out as well.
I did not know about your Irish connection, Stephen. Which distillery are you working with, and how are you coping given the lockdown and you can't travel over? I know Robert Cassell, who lives near here over in Philadelphia, does
Rob and I
New Liberty day-to-day and Connacht whiskey, and he can't get over there either. So how are you coping?
I haven't been to Ireland in 20 months. 20 months. Yeah, about 20 months. We have conference calls. I can't tell you the name of the distillery because they're not public and open yet. We have been running prototypes for them here at Golden Moon for the last 2 years. And those are a variety of different types of whiskeys, multi-grain, pot still, etc. It's a large distillery that's in County Kildare. It's going to be an amazing project when it opens up. It's just cool, and I can't wait for it to come online. Now, we were shut down due to COVID for construction, and 4 months ago, because the building's historical and the building was opened up, the Irish let us begin construction again before everybody else could go back to work. So they're almost back on track. I think we've only lost a year on the timeline.
Okay, folks, you can start your search of the County Kildare planning applications for distillery permits, and we can figure this one out in about 30 seconds here, Stephen. Ty, what are you working on these days?
Well, we are pretty whiskey dominant. We've got a couple of fun projects going on. We just released our first brandy here a few months ago. Like I mentioned earlier, we're in the middle of the Texas wine country and the hill country here. We've probably got 50 wineries within half an hour of where we are, where the distillery is. And so the first one released was a orange muscat. And then we've got a few more coming out in the next year, a couple different red varieties. That's a Knot and a Mourvedre. Also, last year we drove down to the last remaining sugar plant in Texas, down at the Texas-Mexico border, and took a big trailer and brought back about 5,000 pounds of sugar cane, squeezed it all by hand, and we're looking to release a sugarcane rum pretty soon, kind of an agricole style rum. So yeah, it's kind of, a lot of barrel finishes. With the wineries nearby, we get a lot of fun wine barrels. Just build a couple port barrels, and so yeah, a lot of fun stuff.
Steve, I know that you guys basically just consolidated all three of your single malt whiskeys down into a new flagship.
Yeah, that new flagship has quietly released to the world over the past few weeks. To your point, yeah, our what we were calling our core range whiskeys, our American Oak, Sherry Wood, and Peated, will be phased out. We are no longer making those whiskeys, and flagship is kind of is the new whiskey du jour from Westland. In addition to our Outpost range, which very intimately, Mark, we're putting a lot of effort and energy into those projects. So that Outpost range is Garyana, which I'm hoping a lot of people here have heard of and tried. But joining Garyana, which is our exploration into our local species of oak, is Calere, which is also just released. Calere Edition 1 is a project that we've been working on for over 12 years, which explores new varieties of barley, which is super exciting. And then, as we talked about before, that peated project, local Washington State peat, is coming out about a year and a half from now. So those are really the things that we're focused on and really excited to share with everybody these days. We also have our 10-year anniversary coming up, so we'll be doing some fanfare around that. It was actually, today's June 18th. Hot take, June 21st of 2011 was the day Spirit first flowed off our stills here. We had to push back some of the festivities because of the pandemic, so we're going to do something in September that'll come with lots of fun stuff around it, so stay tuned for that.
I hear you're releasing a 10-year-old version of Inferno for this one.
It might be that, Mark. You might be in luck.
Let's hope not.
For those of you who don't know, Inferno was the one that they were one of their April Fool's whiskeys from a few years ago that was matured completely for 4 years in a Tabasco cask.
I believe
and was
proudly. There you go. That's got a bottle. Proudly the lowest scoring whiskey cask ever.
No,
the second lowest.
Second lowest.
Oh,
the only one that was lower was the infamous Pabst Blue Ribbon whiskey that was matured for all of 5 seconds in oak. That was worse,
right.
but not by much.
We're going to take another swing at that honor.
Score to beat. There we go.
Okay. Hey, we do have one final question from our pal Chris Tetsenko down in Australia. They get some Balcones down there, but what about your other guests? Are any of you guys sending whiskeys to Australia yet? Or can you at least send them to Florida where his freight forwarder is located so they can get them shipped over to Australia? Can you guys ship to Florida at least?
So Copperworks is, I think, actually just landed in Australia on the Perth side of the country this week, if not next week. So
I think Chris is in Brisbane,
soon. But we
got to get it to Brisbane.
The distributor we'll have there will be working with some folks getting it around the whole country. So pretty soon for Copperworks.
Westland is certainly in Australia and Florida, but the Calere project that I just spoke about is in Australia. I've heard that it is almost sold out, so I don't know where you might be able to find that, but certainly our other whiskeys are available all across Australia.
Stephen?
So we were down with the USDA trade mission just before COVID. We were in active discussions about 4 different importers, including Dan Murphy's, which is the largest retailer. COVID kind of derailed that. We're hoping to get back on track here in the next few months. And yes, we can ship to Florida if you need us to.
Ty?
I'm afraid I'm the small guy here. We're only filling about 100 casks a year right now, so nothing's making it out of the state of Texas. But I think, kind of an interesting point is brought up here with the patchwork of state laws and distribution. Often you'll find yourself maybe entering a state just to accomplish something else, just to accomplish that nationwide or worldwide shipping. So that's probably going to be our next strategy is ship to a state that's going to allow us to ship to 10 other states, probably.
Florida would let you do that, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Florida, anything goes. We might as well just acknowledge
exactly,
it.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I want to thank you for doing this tonight and for answering a bunch of our questions on American single malts and whiskeys in general. And I like this, Dave Kuhn. We'll call that the Robert Earl Keen distribution model, only in Texas. Yeah. Well said, Dave. Well said. So, again, I want to thank our guests, Steve Hawley from Westland, the president of the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission, Jeff Kanof from Copperworks Distillery, just down the road from Westland in Seattle, Ty Phelps from Andalusia in Blanco, Texas, Jared Himstedt from our Balcones friends in Waco, and Stephen Gould from the Golden Moon Distillery in Golden, Colorado. Guys, thank you for taking the time with us tonight, and continued success and good luck to all of you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for having us, Mark.
And I just want to give you a quick timeline for this because we did not get to the one abbreviation that you've got to watch for. NPRM. This stands for Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Bureaucratic red tape language. Washington speaks its own language. Look for that sometime in December. That's when the TTB is going to tell us what it thinks the definition of American single malt whiskey should be. These guys will probably have objections to what the TTB comes up with. They will raise them. You can raise them because there will be a public comment period following that for about 60 days. Then the TTB will go back, ponder, read the tea leaves, look in their crystal ball and see what they can figure out. And they will come back with a final designation and a definition for American single malt, hopefully by the end of next year, if we're lucky. So that's sort of the way this thing works, and we'll keep you posted about it. Guys, once again, thanks for joining us. Our panelists, thank you for watching. Listen to the podcast this coming weekend, and we will see you next Friday night on the Happy Hour Live webcast. I'm Mark Gillespie. Take care of yourselves, y'all. Good night.